Welcome back, book lovers, to another episode of Dad and Daughter Reads, a book club podcast. I'm your host, James, aka Dad, and today we're diving into a brand new read. We've closed the chapter on Blood over Brighthaven, and now we're stepping into the world of James by Percival Everett. This week we're covering part 1, chapters 1 through 17, and there's already so much to unpack. But of course, I'm not doing this alone. With me, as always, is my brilliant co-host, the queen of sharp insights and even sharper book takes, Miranda. How's it going?
Hello. It's going well. Had a pretty good week. It was a fun week. I'm sleepy. I haven't had a lot of sleep, I feel like, in the past few days, but I'm hanging in there. How's it going with you?
Everything's going fine over here. My deployment at work got pushed back a week, so not as hectic. A little extra time to get things done. So, pretty good. But January is over, and let's talk about what we read in January. So I read 5 books in January. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, consisting of Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. And of course, Blood over Brighthaven, which we did here on the podcast. I think my favorite of the month was Assassin's Quest. So I like the way that story came to a close in that trilogy. Some people I've read didn't really like the ending, but I thought it was fine. Maybe a slight bit rushed, but it was a very long book. It was like 860 pages or so. The way it ended, I kind of liked it. And I won't give any spoilers because there's some pretty cool stuff that happens at the end. This month, I've started and already finished Yellowface. That was really good. I enjoyed that. And then I'll be starting on the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin next. What about you? What did you read in January, Miranda?
Well, the only book that I finished in January, well, the 2 books that I finished in January were The Guest by Emma Cline and Blood over Brighthaven, which I've already discussed on here. But I am in the middle of listening to the Crying in H Mart audiobook. Still, it's sad. I'm at the sad point because her mom has cancer. So I'm getting through that. As much as I can on the subway without getting too down in the dumps. I kind of have to switch between listening to music because it's pretty sad. But then I'm also in the middle of The Witches of El Paso, which I've talked about. And it's really good. I like it a lot. Deals with magical realism and Mexican culture, which I am half Mexican. So that's always fun to read about, like brujeria and things like that. So I really like it. It's really good. It's a good take on generational traumas and things like that. So yeah, that's what I am in the middle of reading and what I finished in January and started in January. So now we'll move on to some user feedback. Jay on Discord had a lot to say about Blood over Brighthaven. First of all, she gave the book a 3.75. She wondered how Mordred would handle taking over the mages. She thinks he's weak, and it's possible someone stronger and more charismatic might take over. That would be interesting. She also said Thaumal was too hurt and isolated in grief to become a revolutionary leader, and really only cared to keep Kara alive. I would agree with that, which is why I think Kara could have been encouraged to do more. She says, with siphoning not destroyed, there's little reason for the Quen to be safe. Siona's actions were driven by personal guilt rather than true leadership, making the conflict chaotic but effective in exposing Tyrann's inhumanity. And she liked the way the book ended with imperfect people making bad decisions, which I also like that as well. I like when things don't end exactly tied up in a fancy and a nice bow.
I must be old-fashioned. I like tied up endings.
Oh, you do? Well,
Sometimes, most of the time.
I guess I just mean more in the sense, and I think she means too, of just things don't always have a happy ending.
Right.
Not so much. Yes, it definitely there were definitely a lot of unanswered questions, but it didn't necessarily need to be a happy ending.
Right. And that's fine, but I do like some questions answered.
Right.
Still have a lot of questions.
Right. Yes. More questions need to be answered. I agree. She also thought there was too much going on and that Tyrann was an amalgamation of all the worst parts of society. And she also wanted more of Kara, which we really all did.
Yes. We wanted more of Kara and more of everything else.
Right. It can have a sad ending, but
right.
don't leave us questioning a million other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Not with a standalone. If it was a series, that's fine because they'll probably get answered. But yeah, the standalone, there's just so many questions.
Right.
Left unanswered. Yeah. All right, and Linda on Discord agreed with most everything that we said, and she gave the book 4 stars, and she wanted the side characters and villains fleshed out more. And she's also heard that it's been compared to Babel by R.F. Kuang, which she has not read yet. And to that, I say, please go read that as soon as possible. Everyone needs to read
Yes.
Babel. It's a great book.
Everyone needs to read Babel. We're Babel stands here.
All right, this is usually the social media book buzz. Not a lot going on in social media right now. Most people are just posting what they read in January and their February TBRs. There was a little bit of drama, but that was from a rage baiting troll that looked like a Muppet. So we are not going to discuss that. Anyway, we'll move on from that and we'll go right into our discussion of James. So, James by Percival Everett is a retelling of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, told from Jim the Slave's perspective. I haven't read Huck Finn in probably, 35, 40 years. I was probably in either middle school or high school at the time. And I'm pretty sure it's not even taught these days due to some of the language in there. Did you read it in high school or middle school, Rand? I don't remember.
No, we did not read it. I don't think we ever had to or needed to. So I haven't read it to this day.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it was pulled from the curriculum probably sometime in the 90s, I would imagine. So at this point, I don't remember much about the story. I know the gist of it, but I don't really have all the details. So the big question is, should you read Huckleberry Finn before reading James? And my answer would be yes, but. Yes, you should read Huckleberry Finn, but I think you should read it after James. At first, I wasn't sure what the answer was, so I went ahead and started reading James. And every time that little white boy popped up doing something stupid, I had to go find out. I wanted to find out what he was doing. So I went ahead and got a copy of Huck Finn. I went ahead and read the first 17 chapters of James first, got a copy of Huck Finn, and then started reading that. And it was interesting. You know, I said I wanted to see what the little white boy was doing, but the more I started reading it, the more I wanted to compare what Jim was doing in that book as compared to the way Everett wrote James in his book. So I found that a lot more interesting, actually. And I actually started skimming over the parts where Jim was not in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Very, very interesting.
I was just, all right. So let's talk about the N word. So it's in this book. And it's even more prevalent in Huckleberry Finn. And I'm not talking about, the version you hear in rap songs. I'm talking about the hard R version. And to me, this is the most vile word in the English language. There's just so much hate involved in that word. I don't like it, and I don't especially like reading it on the page. So while Huck Finn has never been officially banned in the United States, it has been challenged and removed from some school libraries around the country, as well, like I said, dropped from the curriculums. And a lot of this has to do with that word. And I remember having to read parts of books out loud in class. And I couldn't imagine being a Black child and having to read that word or hear someone else, especially a white person, read that word out loud in class. So I'm never for banning books, but I do think this is a sensitive subject that would need some attention from the instructor to talk about first. And I think I read somewhere where some teachers just tell them, or were telling them back when it was in the curriculum, to just say the N word instead of saying that word, which I guess is a little better, but still, I can see why it was pulled from the curriculum. I'm not sure. And I just don't see how well that would go over. I don't remember when I read it, if we read it out loud in class or not, but I couldn't imagine doing that.
Yeah, I think that, I think I guess if you're going to read it in class, like, I don't necessarily know if there's a point in reading it out loud. I feel like in high school, if we were reading books, we never read them out loud. We were always reading them on our own. So yeah, I think
we read in ninth grade, we read books out loud, but that was the last grade. Like once you get to 11th and you're like when you're a junior and you're taking American literature or English literature later, and when you're a senior, you just read to yourself. That's what I remember anyway.
Okay. Yeah. I think the only books that the only things that we read out loud were like Shakespeare, because it was meant to be performed.
True.
I think Huck Finn is a romantic notion of escaping slavery and the time of slavery as a whole. And it should be taught as such if it's introduced in secondary schools. Because it wasn't something that I ever read in school, I'm not really sure how it has been taught in the past. As for the N-word, I'm not sure it's our place to say or discuss. I certainly understand that it's not a word I should use or would ever want to use. I think hopefully we can all agree on that. If you're not Black. You should not be saying that word. However, I can speak as a woman that there has been a renaissance of reclaiming words that both gives the power of those words back to us and makes the words less powerful to those using them against us. So I'm thinking words like bitch, slut, cunt. These are all words that have been derogatory towards women and still are when used in certain contexts. But I know that a lot of women, including myself, have been using those words as more of an empowerment. And I've heard this argument about the N-word from Black people. And in instances like this one in Huck Finn, there's an argument that it should be left alone and studied as a historical text because it's important to remember that there was a time when these things were happening in our society and we let them happen. But I don't think that anyone who isn't Black should have a say about it. I don't think a white person should be able to say whether or not a book that has the N-word should be read or not. I think that that is something that we need to listen to Black people on.
Right. I agree with that. Definitely.
Yeah. But basically, my whole idea is like, I don't think that we shouldn't be discussing this book because I think we should be looking at it as a historical text. And I think it really should be taught as like, hey, like this is kind of a glorification, even though it is an anti-slavery text, it was still written by a white man. And there's still a lot of romantic notions in this book that probably weren't actually true to the slave experience. And we should keep that in mind. And we should read this as a historical text of that. So that's kind of my opinion on it.
Right. And we're talking about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain here.
Right.
And I don't think any book should be banned. And as for banning books, I talked to Jay on Discord. She's actually a librarian, and I asked her about the subject. And she pointed me to the Library Bill of Rights at the American Library Association. And that's also a place where you can donate to help libraries, and you should. I'll just put a link to the Bill of Rights so you can read that. And then from there, if you would like to check out the rest of the American Library Association website.
Yes, that's awesome. We support libraries here. I love the library.
So while we are discussing James, I am going to make comparisons to Huck Finn. So it's like I said, I was reading that as well. And I'll try to keep this separate by calling Jim when I'm referring to Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And I'll call James when I'm talking about James by Percival Everett, just to make that clear, in case there's any confusion, which there still might be.
Sounds good to me. All
right. So let's talk about dialect in this book and in Huckleberry Finn. So when James is around white folks, he talks with a quote unquote stereotypical slave type of dialect. But when he's around other slaves, he speaks more eloquent. So even in Huckleberry Finn, Jim's dialect is actually worse than the Southern dialect of the white folks. And he speaks that way no matter what the audience is. This is known as code switching and survival strategies during slavery, but it's in different ways. In Huckleberry Finn, this was considered groundbreaking at the time in humanizing Jim, but it still played into the racial stereotypes of the 19th century. While in contrast, in James, this code switching represents a critique of Twain's portrayal of Jim, how slaves had to navigate different social situations, and it's also a commentary on identity as a way to survive.
I had the question of how do we know, like, how can we really be sure of how slaves and Black people talked at the time, other than how white people have described it? So I was very much like, where did this slave dialect come from? So I did a deep dive on slave dialect, and it was a very specific, like, vernacular that slaves used because they needed to understand their slave owners and other white people. They needed to understand English. So they learned English, but then of course things derived from that, right? So they were mixing it, they were bilingual, they were mixing it with their own native languages. They all came from different parts of Africa. So it all became this like there's like so many, there were like 4 or 5 different ones that we like know about that they spoke. Just like, you know, the evolution of language in general is always very interesting to me too. And because they had to use it as in a very different way to survive, as we, you know, are talking about in this book as well. So very interesting. And I did some research because I wanted to know, like, how were white authors at the time portraying this language, and were they hyperbolizing the language? Were they making it worse than it actually was? And I found from the Cayuga Museum of History and Art website that many white authors used what they called I dialect, which describes changing the spelling of a word to make it look like a dialect without changing the pronunciation. So writing like said S-E-D instead of said S-A-I-D. And this carries a suggestion that the Black speaker is uneducated rather than merely portraying a way of speaking, versus African American authors at the time, because Harriet Tubman wrote a book, Franklin Douglas wrote a book, and they would use dialect equally among the characters to suggest education level. So even if it was a white character, if they were more higher up in status, then they used standard English dialect, versus if they were a little lower educated, then they had them, they wrote in a different kind of vernacular, versus like white authors at the time were using dialect to denote skin color. Yeah, that was just interesting to me because I really wanted to know, like, did slaves actually speak this way? Like, or was this just a bias that white authors had at the time? Even though Mark Twain was trying to portray this like anti-slavery narrative, he still was a white man. So I really wanted to know, because I thought maybe that's what Everett was also trying to speak on too. Like, slaves didn't actually speak this way. They were a little bit more, they could speak a little bit better than what white people were portraying at the time, I think is where my brain kind of went.
Right. But I think Everett kind of plays it up where he's saying that they might have spoke that way, but only around white people in order to make the white person feel more superior, so that they could, the less you're, as a slave, probably the less you're thought of. And, you don't want to be better or try to act better than the white person because you're going to get in trouble probably.
Right, exactly. Which is why I wanted to look into it, because I was like, wait, like, did slaves actually speak in that way? Or is he saying that they didn't? And it probably was like a mixture. I think he's also hyperbolizing in a way. So there probably was like a mixture in the middle, because of course they did have to, I mean, they came from Africa, they were learning, they did have to, there was a big mix of languages. So, and that you see that with like Creole, like Haitian Creole and like everything, this
definitely.
like how people speak in New Orleans. That's kind of that's why I went on the deep dive, and I wanted to know that. But while I was doing this research too, I also learned that slaves did also develop their own secret languages to communicate. And Tutnese was a very like popular one that they used all over America. It was developed by enslaved African Americans in the 1800s. They had their own special language to communicate with each other in private, and it also helped them learn how to read and write, which I thought was super cool. I had no idea. And apparently a couple years ago, there was a resurgence of Tutnese on TikTok. A lot of African American like young people were like learning how to speak Tut.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because that's like the language that slaves use. So and then there's also all these arguments like, well, how do we respect that language, and is it even okay to be learning it because it was such a forced way of like having to communicate? It was very, very interesting. I thought that was really cool. So I really, really like the way that Everett is using dialogue and language in this book as a theme of how people communicated back in slave times, and how things were written back in those times too, like the books like Mark Twain wrote in those times.
And even today, there are some languages that are used to communicate privately, like Carney folk speak. They have their own language. I actually have a friend that can speak Carney. And I remember when I was a kid, he and his sister knew it, and they would always talk to each other that way when they didn't want anybody else around them to know what they were talking about.
That's funny. Yeah, but and like this one specifically really came as a means of survival, and I thought it was really cool that it also was a way to help them learn how to read and spell so that they communicate in that way, like the power of knowledge. So to me, that means I'm like, okay, like Everett, like, yeah, did these, I don't know, because now I'm really like wondering, like, I bet they were code switching like that back in the day. And so that's why I was like, okay, were slaves actually talking this way? Like, were portrayed from these books that were written in the 1800s, or were they talking much better and people didn't know? I think that's so interesting. That was fun for me to learn about.
I can put a link into the show notes for the Cayuga Museum of History and Art, in case anyone is interested in looking at that. All right, so beginning of chapter 2, we see that James is teaching some children how to speak, and it says, and this is a quote from the book, safe movement through the world depended on mastery of language, fluency.
Yeah, and then he talks about, and then there's a quote where he says, the better they feel, the safer they are. So, like, the better that white people feel their slave masters, then the safer the slaves are. This idea of code switching in a way that makes white people feel more superior is how they stay safe and how they survive, which is so interesting because these days it's like you have, like, that's what code switching is. You have to speak in a way that's more, an elevated, quote unquote, intellectual kind of way in order to be taken seriously. And if you speak in any kind of colloquial way, then you're not taken as seriously. So I like that. It's just such an interesting way to touch on code switching. I think it's really cool. But also just how people of color and Black people specifically have always had to cater to whiteness.
All right. So when we're first introduced to James after he has takes his little nap and has his hat put on the nail, he's talking to Miss Watson, and she asks him if he's been in Judge Thatcher's library room because a book was missing. And then immediately after this scene, we see James with his family. And we see that he's not speaking in a stereotypical dialect. He's speaking standard English. So I think if we put 2 and 2 together here, we know he's literate. And that was not common among slaves at the time. And he probably was, reading those books in Judge Thatcher's library. And to that, I say good for him. Everybody needs to be reading, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and then also, like I said, like when, in the 1800s, they were speaking this, secret language that they made up that was helping them read and spell. So who's to say that there were might have been a lot of slaves who could read and write. They just pretended not to.
Right.
So
that's probably true.
Yeah. Very interesting. It was just such an interesting way I've just never thought about that. So I like that. This book is making me think about those things.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, I know.
All right. So now we want to discuss religion, because a part comes up about religion here next. So this is a quote from the book. There is no God, child. So a child asked him about God, right? And then he says, there is no God, child. There's religion, but there's no God of theirs. Their religion tells that we will get our reward in the end. However, it apparently doesn't say anything about their punishment. But when we're around them, we believe in God. Oh, Lordy Lord, we's be believing. Religion is just a controlling tool they employ and adhere to when convenient. And to that, I say hallelujah. Because it's hard for me to understand why Black people can be so religious, even to this day, can be so religious and into the Christian faith. Because to me, it's a colonizer's religion. It's a religion that was handed down from master to slave. And James points out that while they are promised salvation, there is no punishment for the white slaveholders. So during this time in the U.S., it's said that the slaveholders gave the slaves a slave Bible, right? And this supposedly had huge omissions of any type of rebellion and emphasized obedience and submission to slave masters. Now, these Bibles weren't really that prevalent because the truth is slaves were not allowed to read. But you know damn well no one was preaching to them how Moses led the Israelites to freedom.
Right, yeah. Which is also something I've never thought about because... yeah, of course. Why would they be preaching those things to slaves, giving them ideas? It's like you're preaching that your people long, long ago came out of slavery, and yet you're enslaving all of these people. That's crazy. That's awful. That's awful. Yeah, and I do have to agree with you. I do believe that Christianity has been used in the past to colonize. It has. I don't even believe that. I know that. Like, I know that for a fact. To this day, people are using Christianity to colonize. And it's also always been kind of hard for me to understand how people can accept a faith that was forced upon them. I know as somebody who comes from indigenous roots myself, and my mom is, Mexican, and we've both done a lot to decolonize her more so than me because she believed things for a really, really long time that she doesn't necessarily believe in anymore. And that was really hard to realize and break through because there is so much that people who have been colonized have to break free from. Yes, I agree with you. I also, Christianity has been used. I think though, there is something to say too that it also was a form of faith for them because at some point, a lot of slaves were born in America. They were born in America. They were born to other slaves. They were born already being taught Christianity. They were born learning about Christianity because they had to. They had no other way. Either their parents were making sure that they assimilated correctly, doing what they were supposed to do as slaves so that they didn't get in trouble with white people, or they just really did believe it because they had been there for 200 years. at this point. There's a lot of ways too that religion can transform based off of other customs that they had and based off of other beliefs that they had and that were passed down to them. I think it's probably safe to say that they are practicing a different form of Christianity than what exactly was taught to them in the beginning, because they had their own influences from their own cultures mixed in with it. Because I know that that's a big thing in Latin American countries as well with Catholicism. The way that Latin Americans practice Catholicism is very different from the way Europeans practice Catholicism, because they integrated so much of their own indigenous practices into it. So it's hard for me to understand, but it also makes sense because it was all that they were taught, and they were there for so long learning this religion and had to kind of transform it and also believe in it in a way that helped them out and made them have faith that one day they could break out of this life. So very nuanced subject. But I do agree with you, Dad. This conversation and a lot of other conversations that we have in this book, a lot of themes in this book, stem from James's discussions with Huck. And I think that their relationship in general is really, really interesting, because Huck, as a character, the way that Everett is portraying him, is this very inquisitive, really deep thinking boy. And James really likes that, which is why he takes kind of an affinity to him, because he also has a discussion with another slave, because he's like, the slave is like, this guy is like, why, you gotta be careful with that white boy. Why are you hanging out with this white boy so much? And he's like, I don't know, he's a kid. Like, his dad beats him and all this stuff. Like, he's still a kid. And I think James also really appreciates that, because he's a kid and because he's also kind of had his own version of a hard life. Obviously not as hard as James because he's a slave, but his own version of a hard life, that he is thinking more critically about things, and he is asking really, really smart questions. Like, he asks James, you're not, or he tells James, like, he notices, like, you're not even that much darker than me. And so then James has to explain, like, well, my mom was black, my mom was a slave. And Huck was like, well, what about your dad? He was like, probably not, he was probably white. But it doesn't matter, because you got any kind of part black in you, then you're black to them.
Right.
And Huck has to really sit back and reflect on that and think about that.
And I think James kind of takes up a father figure role for Huck here, with the way, Huck was beaten by his father. And, later on, he will not have a father, as we'll see. But, I think he's trying to take up a father figure for Huck, and, kind of has that kind of feeling towards Huck.
Yeah. And it's easy for him to do, because Huck right now feels so malleable too. Like, he feels like he really is asking such smart questions. And I think it's such a good way to teach him, and help him learn the ways of the world and how things are unfair. Having him keep asking these questions of yeah, let's dig a little deeper into that. Why do you feel this way? And we'll get more into that too, because a lot of discussions that they have kind of end up in that Huck having to really sit back and think about why things are the way they are.
Right. All right. James finds out that he is to be sold and sent downriver to New Orleans. Just him and not his family. And sources estimate that over half of enslaved people were separated from their families, especially children. Enslaved children was a lucrative business, which is absolutely sickening. Pulling, people's children away from them and selling them for money is just awful. James heads off into the woods to escape and ends up on Jackson Island. During this time, Huck's father comes back to town, and Huck ends up faking his own death, which you get a lot more of that in the actual Adventures of Huckleberry Finn than you do here. And he does that to get away from his dad. He runs away and ends up running into James on Jackson Island.
Yeah, and then that's where James is afraid, because he's like, what do you mean you faked your own death? And then I also ran away at the same time. They're going to think that I killed you.
Yeah.
They're going to think that I murdered you, and he's scared. And Huck's like, I didn't even think about that. It's like, of course you didn't, you little white boy, but you just put me in danger,
Right.
I think that was also very Huck, this again, and Huck being kind of like, oh wow, oh, I didn't even think about that. Oops, my bad. It's yeah, you gotta be we gotta think about these things, boy. Things aren't fair. So that was also that was something. I was like, damn, yeah, that's so scary. That's so scary for James. And also this poor kid is like, oh, oops, I just didn't being a kid, but also, damn, you're right. Didn't mean to. He's like, well, why would they think I'd murder you? He's like, because I'm black, because I'm a slave, and I ran away.
Right, at the exact same time.
Right.
I think in Huckleberry Finn, though, Huck fakes his own death first, and then James leaves, or Jim at that point leaves. So it's a little bit different. Anyway,
Does he also have that fear in Huckleberry Finn?
Yes, yes.
He does. Okay.
Yeah. So it's been raining a lot, causing a flood, and they see a house floating down the river. And they go to investigate it, and there's a dead body in the house. And James sees that it's Huck's father, but tells him not to look. Since this is from James's point of view, we know what he saw, which was Huck's father. But in Huckleberry Finn, we don't actually find that out until later in the story. It's like at least 3 or 4 chapters later where we find out that the body Jim saw was Huck's father. And then once they leave that, they go back to their little cave, and James is bitten by a rattlesnake. So James is sick from the venom, and he starts hallucinating about Voltaire, who says he should not be a slave, but also saying an African's features make them unequal to Europeans. So this is commentary by Everett on Voltaire's hypocritical assertions about equality. And here's a quote. This is James saying this. How strange a world, how strange an existence, that one's equal must argue for one's equality, that one's equal must hold a station that allows airing of that argument, that one cannot make that argument for oneself, that premises of said argument must be vetted by those equals who do not agree. And basically, I had to read this a couple times to get the meaning, but it's saying that it's absurd that someone is considered equal, but someone else has to argue that equality on their behalf. So basically, they can't argue. You're saying they're equal, but you won't even let them argue why they're equal. You have to do it for them, which, that sounds exactly like white people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's like something that is still happening to this day for all minorities, like we have to have white people. I feel like this also talks a lot about like white saviorism, and how white people are the ones who have to be making these decisions and talking about these things when they should be talking to minorities should be the ones fighting for them, but then having the white support. Like white people should be uplifting, not explaining for.
Right. They don't need to be out in front. They should be helping from the rear, but they should be helping.
Exactly. Which is like what happens a lot. And it is sad that that's been happening in history forever, and it's still happening to this day. But yeah, but then also Voltaire says too in this, like, that's what equality is, Jim. And he calls him Jim, which I thought was, a white person. Like, that's what he's going to call him. Even though this is James's hallucination, he's still hallucinating that this white man's calling him Jim. But that's what equality is, Jim. It's the capacity for becoming equal.
Yeah, and I didn't even catch that until you just said it. But yeah.
Yeah, because then he talks about, like, Voltaire's like, like, you're still savage. The African people are savage, is like what he goes into this whole rant about how like the African people are savage, but they have the capacity to learn how to be European. And that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for you guys to have the capacity to act like European because we're the superior race, but you have the capacity to be equal just like to us, which was crazy.
Yeah.
Which was crazy. But it's so true. Like that's how people believe. I mean, we still say that's what colonization was. We go to these beautiful places like Africa or like the indigenous Native Americans, and they're doing all of these amazing, they're building all of these amazing things, and they have all of these really, really amazing farming practices and ways of, looking at the sky and telling the weather and all these things. And we're telling them that they're wrong and that they should be doing it this way instead, which for the most part has been very detrimental to our environment. So it's like, we're not actually learning from each other. They're forcing them to do things the way that they want them to be done because they're the quote unquote superior race. So yeah, the whole fever dream was really cool.
Yeah, I did like that part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So James came across some ink and paper. I don't remember where he got that from. It might have been from the house. I don't remember. Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay, but anyway, he uses this to write some words for the first time. And he writes that he is a victim of the curse of ham. And that doesn't mean he had a bad ham sandwich for lunch. I wasn't sure what it meant at first. I actually had to look it up. And it's a biblical story that was used to justify slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so he found some books. And so they're going down the Mississippi in I think they're in just a canoe at first. And they come across a steamboat, a wrecked steamboat. And once they got away from that, and the robbers, that has a little more detail in Huckleberry Finn. There's like a whole 1 or 2 chapters of what happens on steamboat, because I think James stays in the boat while Huck Finn goes in, and then James ends up going in later. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so he found some books there and he wants to read them. but he doesn't want Huck to know about it. And then he realizes, even if he's looking at them, Huck doesn't really know he's reading them. He also realizes the power of reading here. And this is a quote from the book that James said. At that moment, the power of reading made itself clear and real to me. If I could see the words, then no one could control them or what I got from them. They couldn't even know if I was merely seeing them or reading them, sounding them out or comprehending them. It was a completely private affair and completely free and therefore completely subversive.
Mm-hmm.
So this brings me back to How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And Thomas Foster, the author of that, he says that reading is a personal experience. It doesn't really matter what the author was trying to convey because the reader brings in their own experiences, interpretations, and imagination to the text, thereby creating a unique understanding of the story that is not solely dictated by the author. So basically what this is saying is it's not up to the author to tell you how to comprehend or understand what you're reading because you bring all of your own experiences. And I think that's something what James is saying here because, you know, of how he comprehends what he's reading, what he's getting from the book. So it's all up to him. So that was just that part. But there's more to what he said there in that paragraph, which I think you might have something to say about. I was just seeing how it went back to this book that I read about how to read literature like a professor, and it kind of was interesting.
Yeah, and I like your interpretation of that. I also think it was such a really powerful moment because it was a way for him to feel free. He realized that there are some freedoms that can't be taken away from him, which I think is really, really hard. That's a hard realization. Those are hard realizations to have when you're so oppressed. So I just thought that was really powerful that he had that realization in that moment of like, wait a minute, it doesn't matter. Like he can't, how is he supposed to know? Because this is such a private thing. And this, I really liked that because it was just a moment for him to realize that he had control of his own freedom. He has control of his own freedom. And even in this very, very small way, he can control that. He can't let anybody take that away from him. And also just like commenting on how we should be using books today and how there is a freedom in reading and learning and power in that, and that nobody can or should take that away from us, that we are allowed to experience things in whatever way we choose to experience them. So I really loved that moment, especially in our political climate currently.
Right. All right. So Huck asked James if not turning James back over to Miss Watson is wrong. James tells him that if you need to have rules and have good explained to you, then you can't be good. This is another commentary on religion for me. So it's like a lot of Christians say you can't have morals without the Bible, which is bullshit. And I'm with James here. I don't need a manual to tell me how to be a good person. You should just automatically, there's just be something in you that tells you whether something is good and bad from what you've learned growing up, right? And if you can't figure that out on your own, then you've got other problems. And he also mentions the law, and that good has nothing to do with the law because the law says he's a slave. And he's right. Some laws, they aren't good. They just aren't. And back then, under the law, he was a slave, and that wasn't right. That wasn't good. Mm-hmm. So you can't really take all the laws into just to automatically think they're good.
Right. Yeah. Which is something that we struggle with as society currently. It's something that we've struggled with in the past, something that we were struggling with during slave times, when slaves were running with. The Underground Railroad was certainly not legal, but it was the right thing to do. And we had to fight up against, a corrupt government in that way. And then also, we can talk about Germany and the Nazis and how, people were just following orders, but it didn't necessarily mean just because it's the law doesn't mean it's right. We're dealing with
thank God that Nazi problem's over, right?
No, right. Well, I was going to say we're dealing with that today with ICE. Like people, turning in their neighbors to ICE, and it's like, well, we've been dealing with this forever. Like, look at history. Like, just because somebody says this is the law, it doesn't make it right, and we should be able to know that without having to be told. Like, we should be able to know what's right and wrong without having to be told. And it is really hard. It is really hard to discern sometimes for some people. So I like that was explicitly stated in this book. Like the law don't got nothing. The law says this, what do you think about that? And again, questioning Huckleberry Finn, questioning him, making him question things, making him think critically about what's going on in society right now.
Right. And my Nazi comment was I was being facetious, considering that it seems to be making a comeback.
Right. Yes. Caught that.
So they're still going down the Mississippi. I think they picked up a raft somewhere along the way, as well as their canoe. And they run into a group of men looking for runaway slaves. Huck's in the canoe and Jim's on the raft, and he covers him up in a blanket, and he covers for him to the men, telling them that he's just out here fishing, that that's his sick uncle. I think he said it was his sick uncle. Mm-hmm. And so he gets rid of those guys with that by telling them that. Then they go back out on the raft, and it gets caught up in the wake of a steamboat, and that causes the raft to break apart, and they are separated.
Right. Yeah. So it was interesting that after they had that conversation about, Huckleberry kind of questioning, like, is it wrong for me to not be turning you in? And then later on, he's faced with an actual real life situation of, am I going to turn this man in, or am I going to cover for him? And he decides to cover. He decides to cover for him. He decides to hide him and lie and do essentially the right thing.
Right.
So I thought that was really cool. I'm not reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I read a synopsis on Wikipedia. I want everybody to know that I did read the cliff notes of it, so I could get a basic understanding of what's going on in this book. Right. But since you are reading it, like, do we really get what's going on in Huckleberry Finn's mind during this? Do we get a little critical thinking, or are we getting most of his critical thinking from James, as opposed to like in the Huckleberry Finn story? Is he like stopping and thinking like, what should I do right now? Or does he just do it?
I think he just does it in Huckleberry Finn. I don't think there's a lot. I mean, Huckleberry Finn's really short. The chapters are really short. I don't think he does a lot of internal monologue for Huckleberry Finn in that book. He just kind of does it.
Okay. Yeah. So I like that we're not necessarily getting Huck's internal monologue in this, but we are getting James's perception of it.
Right.
So I like that. I like that Everett is even trying to make Huck a deeper character in this book, even though it's not from his perspective. We're seeing it happen from James's perspective. So that's what I was trying to figure out, because I think that that's interesting to have this character written in that way, have this like white boy who was doing all of these grand adventures in one book, like really sitting here and thinking about life and why he's doing the things he's doing and why he's not doing the things he's not doing.
Right. All right, so now James and Huck are separated, and Huck gets caught up with a family feud, which you can read more about that in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, chapters 17 and 18. James washes up on the shore of Illinois and runs into 4 of their black men. They tell him they're in Illinois, but the white folks say they're in Tennessee. And basically what that means is, yeah, you're in a free state, quote unquote, but you're still a slave.
And again, just something that I never thought about, like people doing back then, like lying to their slaves and being like, yeah, Illinois is a free state, but that's not where you're at. You're actually here.
Right. And they probably get away with it too, because it's so rural. Who's going to go out there?
Well, of course.
And say, you're breaking the law, because I mean, this is, way out in the middle of probably nowhere.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like they could get away with that because that's not going to happen. Probably not, because back in this day, there weren't highways. It took fucking days to travel around places. Who's going to tell on them anyway? Like who's tattling on them?
And even if the lawman of the area knows, he may be down with it. So who knows?
Exactly. And also, like you said, like we've said, slaves at the time mostly weren't, they didn't have that knowledge. A lot of them probably did believe they were actually in Tennessee, maybe if they didn't know any better, know? It's like, how would they know? I thought that
these
was
guys know
so
because
awful.
They said they were in Illinois, but the white folks, they were in Tennessee. So they did know.
Well, these
guys did.
But I'm just saying in general, like...
In general, probably that could happen. I see what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was probably possible that slaves really didn't know, or just were being gaslit. Like maybe they were like, oh, no, I thought I was Illinois. And they were like, no, you're in Tennessee. And then being like, oh, maybe I am in Tennessee, because how... It's like you have a feeling, but how do you really, really know? Because how do you look it up?
Right, they didn't.
How do you know for sure?
Maps or GPS at the time, so they have no idea.
Just like look at my current location on my
phone. Being that they're a slave, they probably don't have a lot of time to go anywhere else. Not that the master would let them go anywhere, right? They've probably stuck mostly to their plantation or whatever. So
Right, exactly. So I just thought that was awful. I was like, I never thought about that happening. Of course that happened. Why wouldn't that happen? Why wouldn't the
Yeah,
slave owners lie to these slaves that were supposed to be free and tell them like, no, you're not, because that's not actually the state you're in. That's so
right.
fucked up.
Yeah.
Ugh,
So
terrible.
one of the black men named young George, because there was an old George, there was two Georges. Young George offers to get James a pencil. So James is reading those books he got. He's just chilling out, reading those books. But I guess he has a copy of the Bible. I didn't really catch that. I didn't know if he had a copy of the Bible with him, but he doesn't want to read the Bible, considering it a tool of the enemy. And this is a quote. He says, "I choose the word enemy and still do, as oppressor necessarily supposes a victim." And this is just James refusing to be a victim,
Yeah, I
which I
loved
think is
that.
really cool. Yeah.
I loved that quote. I never thought about it that way. Taking away the power from the oppressors by not calling them oppressors and instead calling them the enemy. I thought that was really, really powerful. And it's something that I'm going to use in my day to day. I already kind of do. I've already kind of told everybody like we got to focus on the common enemy. But
Right.
I think that's such a great way to look at it so that you don't feel victimized in this situation so that you can be like, no, this is a fight I have to fight. Thought that was awesome.
Yeah. So young George brings James a pencil that he stole from his master. James spends some time reading and writing in a safe place, and he finally wants to get going again, and he runs into a gathering of people in the woods. It's dark, and they've got a fire lit. And what this is a group of slaves and some white overseers with young George getting a beating for the pencil he stole. And while this is happening, young George looks in through the thicket and sees James's face, and he mouths the word run, and James did. He started running away. And I think this shows the solidarity that the enslaved people had for one another. And the pencil itself kind of symbolizes forbidden knowledge, right? Kind of like something he's not supposed to have. And because he's not supposed to be writing, he's not supposed to be reading. So the books and the pencil kind of symbolize forbidden knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I agree with you on that. Another really powerful moment too. And yeah, the solidarity that they have for each other and, uplifting each other too in whatever way that they can or helping each other out in whatever way that they can, even if it means like a sacrifice for them. Super powerful.
So while James is running away, he runs back into Huckleberry Finn, and Huckleberry Finn was with some families that were feuding, the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, and they all kind of kill each other right there in front of them. So then Huck and Jim meet back up, and that's where the end of chapter 17. And you'll actually see that if you read the Huckleberry Finn, it kind of happens at the end of chapter 18 in that book.
Oh, wow.
Where they meet back up. Yeah.
Yeah, and then in this moment too is when James slips up. He messes up. He speaks to Huck in standard English.
Yeah.
And Huckleberry's like, "Why are you talking like that? Why are you talking like that? What's going on?" He's like,
Right.
I wouldn't talk like that."
Right, because he said,
And
I think he said ridiculous or something, or hilarious, some word like that. And Huckleberry
yeah,
was kind of surprised because he didn't know that word himself.
well, I think that was earlier. And this
Was
in the
it?
very last, yeah, that happened. He like slipped up a teeny tiny bit, but this time he like slips up real bad because he like has a whole. He's like, "Hey, we got to get out of here. Like, we got to go."
Oh,
And he's
okay.
like having a whole conversation with him in standard English as opposed to the slave vernacular, and because Huckleberry doesn't even like say anything about it until they already leave. And then he's like, "Why were you talking like that earlier?" And he was like, "I wasn't. What do you mean? I wasn't talking like nothing." But just again, for me, that was like another moment into, well, I mean, one, James kind of being like scared and like having to, like fix the situation, but also another way of Huckleberry being so astute and like noticing things and still kind of questioning things.
Right.
So I just really I found it really fascinating because he was confused by it. He wasn't necessarily mad by it. Just another way for him to have to like think about things,
Right.
which I thought was cool.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting the way Everett is writing Huckleberry Finn in this book as well, and having him question things. And like you said, it's like Huckleberry Finn is actually doing some critical thinking.
Yeah, I think it's awesome, and I'm excited to see where that goes with the rest of the book. Like, I'm excited to
Right.
see what kind of character development that we get from Huckleberry Finn. And since you're reading the book, I'm wondering, like, is it gonna be different Are we going to get more insight or like things that we don't get from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that we're going to get out of James? I think that'll be really interesting. It'll be interesting how he uses Huck as a character in James.
Right.
Yeah. And that wraps up our discussion on part 1 of James by Percival Everett. We're just getting started with this one, and there's already so much to dig into. So next time we'll be covering the rest of part 1, chapters 18 through 32. So be sure to read along and join us for that conversation. In the meantime, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you in these first chapters? Drop us a message on Discord, TikTok, Instagram, or Blue Sky. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for spending your time with us, and as always, keep turning those pages. See you next time.
Our intro music is Upbeat Funk, performed by Mikhail Smusev, and our outro music is Lo-Fi Chill, medium version, performed by Bodan Kuzmin. You can find both tracks on pixabay.com. Thanks for joining us, family, and we'll see you next week.